I'll never forget the sound of my daughter's voice that morning. Not the words she said, but the tone. Cold, clipped, efficient. Like she was firing an employee instead of talking to her own mother. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation." I was standing in her kitchen. The one I helped her pick out when she bought the condo. The marble countertops I'd saved for months to help pay for gleamed under recessed lighting I'd installed myself. My hands were soapy from washing her breakfast dishes, something I'd done every Sunday for the past year since I moved in. "Living situation," I repeated, turning off the faucet slowly. Jessica crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe in her pristine white blazer. Behind her, I could see her husband Marcus hovering, pretending to look at his phone but clearly listening to every word. "Marcus and I have been talking," she began, and my stomach dropped. Nothing good ever starts with those words. "We're thinking about starting a family soon, and we're going to need the space." The space. She meant my room. The guest bedroom I'd been sleeping in for 14 months. Ever since the divorce left me with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. "I see," I said quietly, drying my hands on a towel she'd probably rather I hadn't touched. "When were you thinking?" "End of the month would be ideal." 3 weeks. She was giving me 3 weeks to find somewhere to go. Somewhere I could afford on my part-time library salary, and the pittance of alimony that barely covered my medication. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind her of every sacrifice, every missed opportunity, every dream I'd buried so she could have hers. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded like I understood, like this was reasonable, like my own daughter hadn't just made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. "Kay," I whispered. "I'll figure something out." She didn't even look relieved. She just nodded, grabbed her purse, and left for brunch with friends. People who mattered more than I did. I sat down at that expensive kitchen table, and stared at my reflection in the polished surface. 62 years old, gray hair I couldn't afford to color anymore. Hands worn from decades of work nobody ever thanked me for. And now, officially homeless, the irony wasn't lost on me. The same hands that had rocked Jessica to sleep every night for years. That had worked double shifts at the diner to pay for her dance classes, her college applications, her wedding, were now washing her dishes while she planned to throw me out. But this story doesn't start there. It starts 37 years earlier, in a delivery room that smelled like disinfectant and broken promises. I was 25 when I had Jessica. Her father, David, stood next to me holding my hand, telling me everything was going to be perfect. We'd been married 6 months. He worked construction, I worked as a secretary. We had a tiny apartment and big dreams. "She's going to have everything we didn't," he said when they placed her in my arms. "Dance lessons, good schools, college, everything." I believed him. I believed in us. I believed in the future we were building. For the first few years we tried. David worked long hours and I quit my job to stay home with Jessica. Money was tight, but we were happy. Or at least, I thought we were. The cracks started small. David coming home later and later. Paychecks that seemed smaller than they should have been. The smell of perfume on his collar that definitely wasn't mine. I ignored it at first. Told myself I was being paranoid, that he was just stressed about money. But denial only works for so long. I found out about the affair when Jessica was 4. A woman from his job site, younger, prettier. Without the stretch marks and exhaustion that came with motherhood. He didn't even try to deny it. "I made a mistake," he said, as if 20 months of lying was just a simple error in judgment. "But I'm choosing you. I'm choosing our family. I should have left then." But I was terrified. Terrified of being alone, of raising Jessica without him, of admitting I'd failed. So I stayed. For 13 more years I stayed. I became an expert at swallowing pain. At pretending everything was fine when he came home smelling like beer and someone else's perfume. At explaining to Jessica why Daddy was always so tired, so distant, so angry. I went back to work when Jessica started school. Took a job at the library that paid just enough to keep us afloat when David's paychecks mysteriously shrunk. I packed lunches, helped with homework, attended every school event, and slowly disappeared into the background of my own life. Jessica didn't notice. She was too busy being a teenager. Too wrapped up in her own world to see that her mother was drowning. And I didn't blame her for that. That's what I'd wanted, wasn't it? For her to be happy, carefree, unburdened by our problems. David left for good when Jessica was 17. Not for another woman this time, just for the open road and a life without responsibilities. He sent divorce papers from Nevada and never looked back. I thought Jessica and I would grow closer after he left. That maybe, without him between us, we'd finally connect. But she was preparing for college, already pulling away, already built a life that didn't include me. I got into Stanford, she announced one evening, waving the acceptance letter like a golden ticket. My heart sank and soared at the same time. Stanford, across the country, expensive beyond belief. That's amazing. Honey, I said, pulling her into a hug she barely returned. We'll figure out the money. And we did. I took out loans I knew I'd never be able to pay back. Worked extra shifts at the library and picked up weekend work cleaning houses. I ate ramen and wore clothes from thrift stores so Jessica could have a meal plan and a dorm room and textbooks that cost more than my monthly rent. She called sometimes during her first semester. Then less during her second. By junior year, our conversations were down to obligatory Sunday evening check-ins where she talked about classes and internships and friends I'd never meet, and I listened and pretended my life was equally full. How are you, Mom? She'd ask in a tone that suggested she didn't really want the honest answer. I'm great, sweetie. Just working. Same old, same old. I never told her about the second mortgage I took out on our tiny house. Never mentioned the nights I lay awake calculating bills, juggling credit cards, skipping meals. She didn't need to know. That was my job to protect her from the ugly realities of making ends meet. She graduated with honors. Got a job at a consulting firm in New York. Met Marcus at a company retreat. They were engaged within a year. I flew to New York for the wedding, wearing a dress I'd bought on clearance and altered myself. I sat in the front row and watched my daughter marry a man I'd met exactly twice, surrounded by his large, wealthy family who looked at me with polite confusion, like they couldn't quite figure out how I fit into the picture. At the reception, Jessica barely spoke to me. She was too busy networking, making impressions, being the perfect bride for Marcus's colleagues and family. I sat at a table with distant relatives I didn't know and ate expensive food that tasted like nothing. Your daughter's quite accomplished, one of Marcus's aunts said to me, in a tone that implied surprise someone like me could have produced someone like Jessica. She is, I agreed, smiling until my face hurt. I left the reception early. No one noticed. For the next few years we settled into a pattern. Brief phone calls on holidays, texts on birthdays, visits so rare I could count them on one hand. Then my world fell apart. Again. The library downsized. Budget cuts, they said. I was let go with 2 weeks severance and a letter thanking me for my years of service. At 61. I was too old to find comparable work and too young to retire. The bills piled up fast, the mortgage, the credit cards, the medical expenses from a health scare I'd been ignoring, because I couldn't afford to address it. Within 6 months, the bank foreclosed on the house. I called Jessica from a motel room, the kind with stained carpets and a neon sign that flickered all night. Mom, what's wrong? She sounded annoyed, not concerned. I lost the house, honey. I'm so sorry to bother you, but I don't have anywhere to go. Silence, long, heavy silence. Can't you stay with friends? Friends. The ones I'd lost touch with over decades of working too much and having too little to offer. The ones who disappeared when I couldn't afford to go out anymore, couldn't contribute to group gifts, couldn't keep up. I don't really have anyone, I admitted, hating how small my voice sounded. More silence. Okay, she finally said. You can stay with us for a while. Just until you get back on your feet. A while, temporary, conditional. I moved into Jessica and Marcus's guest room with my 2 suitcases, and what remained of my dignity. They made it clear from day one that this was charity, not family. We have rules. Marcus explained on my first night, standing in the doorway like a landlord instead of my son-in-law. No guests. Quiet after 9 p.m., clean up after yourself. And we'd appreciate it if you could contribute something toward utilities. Contribute? With what money? I wanted to ask. But I just nodded. I tried to make myself useful. Cooked meals they barely touched, cleaned rooms that were already spotless, ran errands they didn't ask me to run. Anything to justify my existence in their perfect, controlled life. Jessica started avoiding me. She'd come home from work and go straight to her room. We'd eat dinner in silence, Marcus scrolling through his phone. Jessica talking about colleagues I didn't know, both of them acting like I was a piece of furniture they'd inherited and didn't know what to do with. I felt like a ghost. Present but invisible, breathing but not really living. The final straw came on a Thursday evening. I'd made dinner lasagna, Jessica's favorite when she was growing up. I set the table, lit candles, tried to create some warmth in cold, modern dining room. They came home together, saw the spread, and exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. "Mom, we appreciate this," Jessica said carefully. "But Marcus and I are actually trying this new meal plan. We can't really eat heavy foods like this anymore." I looked at the lasagna I'd spent hours making with money I didn't have. "Oh, I didn't know." "It's fine," Marcus said, already pulling out his phone to order something else. "We'll just grab something light." They left the food untouched from plastic containers in front of the TV. While I sat at the empty table, staring at my failed attempt to connect. That's when I knew. Really knew I wasn't wanted here. I was tolerated at best, resented at worst. Which brings me back to that Sunday morning. To Jessica telling me I needed to leave. To the moment I realized my own daughter saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience. The end of the month came faster than I expected. I spent those 3 weeks frantically searching for somewhere, anywhere, I could afford. Studio apartments wanted deposits I didn't have. Roommate situations fell through. Senior housing had year-long waiting lists. On my last day, I packed my suitcases in silence. Jessica and Marcus had conveniently planned a weekend trip, probably to avoid the awkwardness of watching me leave. I stood in the doorway of that guest room one last time, looking at the space I'd tried so hard to make feel like home. The bed I'd made every morning with military precision. The corner where I'd kept my few belongings, carefully organized to take up as little room as possible. The window I'd stared out of countless nights, wondering how my life had become so small. I left the key on the kitchen counter and walked out. I spent that night in my car parked outside a 24-hour diner. The next night too. And the one after that. It's strange what you think about when you're living in your car. Not the big philosophical questions about life and meaning. Mostly just logistics. Where can I shower? Where can I park without being harassed? How do I stay warm when the temperature drops? I found a gym that offered month-to-month memberships just so I could use the showers. I parked in different lots every night, moving before anyone noticed I was sleeping there. I survived on free samples from grocery stores, and the cheapest items from Dollar Menace. And through it all, I kept my phone on, hoping Jessica would call. That she'd realize what she'd done, feel some pang of guilt or love or basic human decency, and reach out. She didn't. 3 months into my new reality, I ran into an old acquaintance at the library. Patricia, someone I'd worked with decades ago. She barely recognized me. And I don't blame her. I'd lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, my clothes were wrinkled from being slept in. My hair desperately needed washing. "Sarah. Is that you?" I wanted to lie, to pretend I was someone else, anyone else. But I was too tired. "Hi, Patricia." She looked at me with concern that felt like pity. "Are you okay? You look..." "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Just going through some changes." We talked for a few minutes, superficial catching up that felt hollow. But as she was leaving, she stopped. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you, but I run a women's shelter downtown. If you ever need anything, here's my card." I took the card with shaking hands, ashamed that my situation was so obvious, grateful that someone had noticed at all. That night, sitting in my car in a dark parking lot, I stared at that card for hours. A shelter. I'd reached the point where a shelter was my best option. Part of me wanted to call Jessica, to tell her how bad things had gotten. To force her to see what her abandonment had led to. But I knew it wouldn't matter, she'd made her choice. I was on my own. I called Patricia the next morning. The shelter was nothing like I'd imagined. It was clean, warm, and full of women who looked just like me, tired, broken, invisible to the world but still fighting to survive. I got a bed in a shared room, 3 meals a day, and access to resources to help me get back on my feet. It wasn't home, but it was safe. For the first time in months, I could sleep without worrying about being moved along by police or harassed by strangers. Patricia helped me apply for assistance programs, update my resume, practice interview skills. She never asked what happened, never made me feel judged for ending up there. She just helped, simply and genuinely. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah," she told me one afternoon. You've survived this long, you'll survive what comes next too. I wanted to believe her. Slowly, painfully, I started rebuilding. Got a part-time job at a bookstore. Saved every penny. Applied for low-income housing. Attended support groups at the shelter where women shared stories that made mine feel less unique, less shameful. 6 months later, I moved into a tiny efficiency apartment in a building that had seen better days. It had a leaky faucet, paper, thin walls, and a view of a brick wall. But it was mine. No one could take it away from me. No one could tell me to leave. I furnished it slowly with items from thrift stores and things people left on curbs. A table with wobbly legs. A chair with a stain I covered with a throw blanket. A bed frame I assemble myself with instructions in 3 languages, none of which I spoke well. It wasn't much. But it was enough. Through all of this, I never called Jessica. Part of me wanted to tell her I'd survived despite her, that I'd found my footing without her help. But mostly, I just wanted to move forward. Then, 2 years after she kicked me out, my phone rang. Her name lit up the screen, and my heart stopped. I almost didn't answer. Almost let it go to voicemail, let her wonder if I was alive or dead or simply done with her. But old habits die hard and some part of me still hoped. Hello. Mum. It's me. As if I wouldn't know her voice. As if I hadn't carried her for 9 months, raised her for 18 years, loved her for every day of her life. Hi Jessica. I wanted to let you know that Marcus and I are expecting. You're going to be a grandmother. The words hung in the air between us. She was calling to share good news. To include me in this milestone, as if the past 2 years hadn't happened. As if she hadn't thrown me away like garbage. Congratulations, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Thanks. I thought you'd want to know. Silence. How are you? She asked, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. I'm fine. Good, that's good. Listen. Maybe we could have lunch sometime. Before the baby comes. She wanted something, I could hear it in her voice. She wanted me back in her life, on her terms, when it was convenient for her. Maybe to babysit. Maybe to have a grandmother in the picture for appearances. Maybe, I said. I'm pretty busy these days. It wasn't entirely a lie. I'd filled my life with work, with volunteering at the shelter that had saved me. With hobbies I'd never had time for before. I'd built something small but real, and I wasn't sure I wanted to risk it. We said goodbye, and I sat in my little apartment, staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to rush back to her, to accept whatever scraps of affection she was willing to offer. The mother in me, the one who'd sacrificed everything, still ached to be part of her life. But another part, the part that had learned to survive, that had discovered I could exist without her validation, that part hesitated. I thought about all those years of giving. Of pouring myself out until there was nothing left. Of believing that's what love meant. Endless sacrifice without expectation of return. I'd been wrong. Real love goes both ways. Real family shows up in the hard times, not just the Instagram-worthy moments. Real relationships can't be built on guilt and obligation. Jessica called again a week later. And the week after that. Each time, her tone grew slightly more desperate, as if she was realizing I might not come running back. Mom? I want you in the baby's life, she said during her 5th call. I know things have been difficult, but family is important. Family is important. I repeated slowly. Where was that sentiment 2 years ago when you put me out on the street? Silence. I thought you'd land on your feet. You always did. I lived in my car, Jessica. For 3 months. Then a homeless shelter. I heard her sharp intake of breath. I didn't know. You didn't ask. More silence, heavy with unspoken regrets. I'm sorry, Mom. I really am. I was selfish and cruel, and I've regretted it every day since. The words I'd wanted to hear for 2 years. But they felt hollow now, too little too late. I appreciate that. I said carefully. But I need time. How much time? I don't know. We ended the call without resolution, and I felt surprisingly okay about it. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. Just tired. Tired of bending myself into shapes to fit into other people's lives. That evening, I volunteered at the shelter. Helping serve dinner to women who reminded me of where I'd been. Patricia joined me in the kitchen. You seem different lately, she observed. Lighter somehow. I'm learning, I said, stirring a pot of soup, that I don't have to set myself on fire to keep other people warm. She smiled. Took me 60 years to learn that lesson too. As I ladled soup into bowls, I thought about Jessica's baby. My grandchild, who'd be born into a world of privilege I never had, wanted by parents who'd planned and prepared for their arrival. I hope they teach that baby about love. Real love. The kind that shows up, that sacrifices, yes, but also expects basic human dignity in return. I hope they do better than I did. Better than Jessica did. And if they wanted me in that child's life, truly wanted me, not as free childcare or a box to check on the perfect family checklist, but as a person worthy of respect and love, then maybe, someday I'd be ready. But it would be on my terms. In my time. With boundaries I'd never learned to set before. Because I'd spent 62 years learning that you can't pour from an empty cup. That martyrdom isn't the same as motherhood. That the greatest love you can give is sometimes learning to love yourself enough to walk away from people who treat you as disposable. I'd lost everything. My marriage, my home, my daughter's respect. I'd hit bottom in ways I never imagined possible. But I'd survived, and in surviving, I'd found something I didn't know I was missing. Myself. The woman I'd been before I became a wife, a mother. A caretaker who forgot she was also a person deserving of care. She'd been buried under decades of putting everyone else first, but she was still there. Tired, weathered, scarred but unbroken. And she was enough. As I cleaned up the shelter kitchen that night, I caught my reflection in the steel of the sink. Gray hair I'd stopped being ashamed of. Lines around my eyes from years of worry that were slowly transforming into something that looked almost like wisdom. Hands still strong enough to work, to help, to build a life that belonged only to me. I smiled at that reflection. "We made it," I whispered. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. Jessica had her baby 3 months later. A girl named Emma. She sent me a photo, them in the hospital, exhausted and glowing with new parent joy. "She has your eyes," the text said. "We'd love for you to meet her." I looked at that tiny face, so new, so innocent, and felt a pull I thought I'd buried. But I didn't respond right away. I saved the photo and went about my day, working my shift at the bookstore, having coffee with Patricia, returning to my small apartment that still had that leaky faucet I'd learned to live with. That night I drafted a response. "She's beautiful. When you're ready. On a day that works for both of us, I'd like to meet her. But Jessica, if I'm going to be part of her life, I need to know I'm part of yours too. Not just when it's convenient. Not just when you need something. Really part of it. I need to matter." I stared at those words for a long time before hitting send. Her response came an hour later. "You do matter, Mom. You always have. I just forgot to show it. We start over. For real this time." Starting over. As if we could erase everything that happened. Rewrite history with a happier ending. We couldn't. The hurt was still there, scars that would never fully fade. But maybe, just maybe, we could start something new. Not a do-over. But a different chapter. One where I showed up as a whole person. Not just a sacrificial offering. Where she treated me with the respect I'd finally learned I deserved. "We can try," I typed back. "One day at a time." And that's where I am now, taking it one day at a time. Building relationships that honor who I am, not just what I can give. Learning that saying no is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. I met Emma last week. Held her in my arms and felt that surge of love that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Jessica watched nervously, as if afraid I'd disappear again. "She's perfect," I said, and meant it. "I want to be a better mother than I was a daughter," Jessica said quietly. "Want her to know her grandmother." I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her, and saw not the woman who'd hurt me, but a new mother terrified of failing her child the way she felt she'd failed me. "Then show up," I said simply. "That's all anyone really needs. Show up." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I don't know how this story ends. Maybe Jessica and I rebuild something real. Maybe we don't. Maybe this fragile piece we're building will hold, or maybe it'll shatter again. But I know this, I'll be okay either way. Because I learned the hardest lesson of all. You can love someone completely and still choose yourself. You can forgive without forgetting. You can open your heart again while keeping your boundaries intact. I lost everything to learn that, and somehow, that makes it the most valuable lesson of all. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible, disposable, like you don't matter, I want you to know something. You do matter, your story matters. Your pain is valid, and your survival is remarkable. Don't wait for other people to see your worth. See it yourself. And when you do, when you finally understand that you are enough, exactly as you are, that's when everything changes. That's when you stop living for others and start living for yourself. That's when you come home. Not to a place, but to yourself. And that, after everything, is the only home that truly matters.